Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The attic smelled of dust and forgotten memories. Tom wrinkled his nose as he climbed the creaky wooden stairs, a dim light from his flashlight flickering off old trunks and faded furniture. The house had been his grandmother's and passed down through generations. Now it was his a relic from another time, and today, after weeks of procrastinating, he was finally brave enough to explore its most neglected room. At the top of the stairs, he pushed open the door, and the heavy scent of aged wood and stale air greeted him. Tom swept the light across the space, the beam revealing a maze of old boxes, broken chairs, and stacks of newspapers, yellowed and brittle with time. A large grandfather clock sat in the corner, its pendulum still frozen in the path. It was quiet eerily, but there was something calming about it. He had always liked old things with history. He stepped inside, careful to avoid the splintered floorboards, and moved deeper into the attic. His gaze caught on something at the back of the room, tucked behind a set of old moth-eaten curtains. It shimmered faintly in the weak light, drawing him in like a magnet. Curious, he pushed aside the curtain, revealing an antique mirror, its frame intricately carved with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. Tom leaned closer, brushing the dust off the surface. His own reflection stared back at him, but something fell off. The reflection didn't quite match his movements. He tilted his head to the left, but his reflection seemed delayed, almost hesitant. His heart skipped a beat. "What the?" he whispered, stepping back. He stood there for a moment, unsure whether he was imagining things. Slowly he reached out, his fingertips hovering just above the cool surface of the glass. He didn't know what compelled him to do it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something else entirely. But the moment his fingers touched the mirror, a surge of energy pulsed through his hand. The air crackled, and before he could pull away, the mirror rippled like water. Tom's body was yanked forward and he fell through the glass. He hit the ground hard, groaning as the impact knocked the wind from his lungs. When he opened his eyes, he expected to see the dusty attic around him, but it wasn't there. Instead, he found himself lying in the middle of a street. The sky above was dark, heavy with thick clouds that seemed unnaturally close, casting an eerie shadow over the landscape. Tom pushed himself to his feet, wincing as he brushed dirt off his jeans. The street looked familiar, but not quite right. The buildings, the trees, even the parked cars, all of it was wrong. The angles of the houses were off, their walls leaning in ways that made his stomach churn, and the street itself seemed to curve unnaturally, bending where it should be straight. "Where the hell am I?" he muttered to himself. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. This was his street, the street he'd grown up on. But it had changed, warped into something grotesque. As he tried to make sense of it, a figure stepped out from behind one of the distorted buildings. Tom's breath caught in his throat. It was him, but not him. The man standing across the street was identical to Tom in every way, down to the clothes he was wearing. But there was something different about him, something in the way he carried himself. He was confident, assured, his stance relaxed in a way that Tom's never was. The man's eyes locked onto Tom's, and a grin spread across his face. "Shh. Well, look who finally showed up." Tom's mouth went dry. Who are you?" The other Tom, or Tim, as he would later come to call him, laughed, a sound that sent shivers down Tom's spine. "I am you, obviously," Tim said, his voice smooth and dripping with sarcasm. "Or at least, I am who you could have been." Tom blinked, trying to process what he was seeing. What the hell does that mean? Tim sighed, rolling his eyes as if he'd heard the question 1,000 times before. "This is a parallel world, genius. You stepped through the mirror, and now you're in my world. And guess what? Our worlds are connected. Everything that happens here affects your world, and vice versa." Tom shook his head, taking a step back. "This is crazy. I must be dreaming." "I wish it were that simple," Tim said, stepping closer. "But this is very real. And if we don't top what's coming, both of our worlds are screwed." Tom's mind raced, his instincts screaming at him to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But something in Tim's eyes, in the urgency of his voice, kept him rooted in place. "What do you mean?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tim's expression darkened, and he glanced over his shoulder, as if checking for something or someone. "There's a force, an ancient one, that's been using these mirrors as gateways between worlds for centuries. It's been growing stronger, feeding off the energy of both dimensions. If it gets through, if it merges our worlds completely, there'll be no going back. Everything will collapse. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. And you want me to help you stop it? Tim shrugged. You don't really have a choice. It's all your world on the line, too. For a moment, Tom hesitated. This was insane. A parallel world, an ancient evil. It sounded like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. But the more he thought about it, the more everything seemed to click into place. The strange reflection in the mirror, the pull he felt when he touched the glass, the warped version of his street. It all made sense in a twisted, impossible way. What do we do? Tom asked, his voice steadier now. Tim's grin returned, though it was more serious this time. We find the mirror shard. There's one in your world and one in mine. They were the key to stopping this thing. We destroy them and we cut off its power. Tom nodded, though doubt still gnawed at the edges of his mind. And how do we do that? Tim smirked. That's it. The fun part. We have to find them first. Before Tom could respond, a low rumbling growl echoed from the shadows, sending a spike of fear through his chest. Tim's eyes narrowed, and he grabbed Tom's arm, pulling him toward an alleyway. Time to move, Tim muttered, his voice tense. They found us. Tom didn't have time to ask who they were before a group of figures emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing an unnatural red. They moved with eerie precision, their bodies almost robotic in their fluidity. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he followed Tim, ducking into the alley just as the creatures lunged toward them. They were mirror hunters, Tim explained as they ran, servants of Mordain, the one trying to merge our worlds. They track anyone who crosses between dimensions. Tom's breath came in ragged gasps as they weaved through the maze of narrow streets, the hunters hot on their heels. His mind was racing, the reality of the situation crashing down on him with every step. This was real. He was in another world, being chased by supernatural creatures, and somehow he had to stop an ancient evil from destroying everything. What happens if they catch us? Tom asked between breath. Tim glanced at him, a grim smile on his face. Let's just say you want to be waking up in your bed tomorrow. The alley opened up into a larger street, and Tim skidded to a stop, pulling Tom behind a set of overturned trash cans. The mirror hunters slowed, their glowing eyes scanning the area. Tom held his breath, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure they could hear it. After what felt like an eternity, the hunters moved on, disappearing into the shadows once more. Tim let out a sigh of relief and stood up, brushing dirt off his jacket. That was close, he muttered. Tom pushed himself to his feet, still trying to catch his breath. What next? Tim looked at him, his expression serious. Now we find the shard. Tom wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded. He could feel the tension in the air, as if the very atmosphere was thick with danger. Tim led the way, keeping close to the walls as they moved deeper into the heart of the city. The streets were quieter here, though. Every so often, Tom could hear the distant echo of footsteps, reminding him they were far from safe. Tim seemed to know where he was going. They weaved through narrow alleys and side streets, passing by crumbling buildings and twisted architecture that made Tom's head spin. It was disorienting, the way everything seemed familiar but wrong at the same time. This world was a distorted reflection of his own, and the longer they stayed here, the more it felt like reality was slipping through his fingers. They eventually stopped in front of a large crumbling building with boarded-up windows. The sign above the door had long since faded, but Tom could make out the faint letters spelling the looking glass. Tim glanced at him before pushing open the door, the hinges creaking loudly in the quiet night. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust, the furniture was overturned, and shattered glass littered the floor. It looked like the place had been abandoned for years, though Tom had a feeling that wasn't entirely true. Something about the place felt alive, as if the walls themselves were watching them. Tim moved quickly, stepping over the broken furniture and heading toward the back of the building. Tom followed, his heart pounding in his chest. There was something deeply unsettling about this place. His eyes kept darting to the mirrors on the walls, all cracked or broken, their reflective surfaces warped like everything else in this world. Tim stopped in front of a large mirror in the back room, the only one that wasn't damaged. It was an ornate floor-length mirror with a gilded frame that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Tim crouched down, inspecting the edges. This is it, he said quietly. The shard is hidden behind this mirror. It's been here for centuries, waiting for someone to find it. Tom stepped closer, staring at the mirror. His reflection looked back at him, but something about it felt Off again, the eyes were too dark, the expression too serious. It was as if the mirror was showing him a version of himself that he did to Hennessy. "How do we get it out?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tim pulled a small silver knife from his belt and handed it to Tom. "You were the one who crossed into this world. You have to be the one to break the seal." Tom hesitated, staring at the knife in his hand. "What happens if I do this? Are we sure this is the right move?" Tim's eyes narrowed slightly, impatience creeping into his voice. "There's no time to second guess. Mordane's forces are probably tracking us as we speak. If we don't get this shard, it's set over for both of our worlds." Tom swallowed hard and nodded, gripping the knife tightly. He approached the mirror, the surface shimmering slightly as he raised the blade. For a moment, he hesitated, fear gnawing at his insides. But then he thought about his world, the people he cared about, the life he had. He couldn't let it all be destroyed. With a deep breath, he plunged the knife into the corner of the mirror. The glass didn't shatter like he expected. Instead, the surface rippled, almost like liquid, and a small glowing shard emerged from the center, floating gently toward him. It was no bigger than a coin, but it pulsed with a strange ethereal energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Tom reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he took the shard. The moment his fingers closed around it, a surge of power coursed through his body, making him stumble back. It felt like the shard was alive, humming with an energy he couldn't quite comprehend. Tim was by his side in an instant, his expression serious good. "Now we have to get back to your world. The shard in your dimension is the final key." Before Tom could respond, a loud crash echoed from the front of the building. The door had been thrown open, and the sound of heavy footsteps filled the air. The mirror hunters had found them. "Run," Tim shouted, grabbing Tom by the arm and pulling him toward the back exit. They burst through the door into a narrow alley, the sound of their pursuers close behind. Tom's heart raced as they sprinted through the maze of streets, dodging obstacles and taking sharp turns to lose the hunter. But no matter how fast they ran, the footsteps seemed to grow louder, closer. "We can't outrun them forever," Tom shouted, his voice strained from exertion. Tim didn't answer. At first, his eyes scanning the area as they ran. Then, without warning, he veered to the right, heading down a narrow street that seemed to dead end at a wall. Tom's stomach dropped as he realized they were trapped. "What are you doing?" Tom yelled, panic rising in his chest. Tim didn't slow down. "Trust me." They reached the wall, and Tim skidded to a stop, placing his hand on a small hidden panel. There was a low hum, and part of the wall shifted, revealing a hidden passage. Tom's eyes widened in surprise, but there was no time to question it. They dashed through the opening just as the wall slid back into place, cutting off the hunter's pursuit. The passage led them into a dark, winding tunnel. It was narrow, barely wide enough for them to walk side by side, and the air was damp and cold. Tom could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance, echoing in the silence. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a small, dimly lit chamber. In the center of the room stood another mirror, identical to the one in the building they had just left. Tim approached it, his face tense with determination. "This is it," Tim said, turning to Tom. "This mirror will take us back to your world." Tom nodded, his grip tightening around the shard in his hand. He wasn't sure what awaited them on the other side, but he knew they didn't have a choice. The fate of both worlds rested on what they did next. Together, they stepped through the mirror. The sensation was the same as before, a disorienting pull like being yanked through water. When Tom's feet hit solid ground again, he stumbled, feeling a wave of dizziness wash over him. But when he opened his eyes, he was back in the attic. The familiar musty smell of the old house filled his nostrils, and for a moment he allowed himself to breathe a sigh of relief. But it wasn't over yet. Tim stood beside him, looking around the attic with a sense of urgency. "The shard in this world should be here somewhere. We have to find it before they do." Tom's gaze swept the room, his eyes landing on the mirror, the same mirror that had brought him to the parallel world in the first place. He crossed the room quickly, crouching down to inspect the frame. And there, hidden in the intricate carvings, was the shard just like before. It shimmered faintly, as if it was waiting for him. He reached out and carefully pried it loose. The moment he held both shards in his hands, the room seemed to tremble. The air grew thick with energy, and Tom could feel a presence pressing down on him, something dark, something ancient. "Mordane," Tim muttered, his voice tight with fear. "He's coming." Before Tom could respond, The attic door burst open. A figure stood in the doorway, cloaked in shadow. His eyes glowed with a sinister light, and his voice was like ice when he spoke. "You think you can stop me?" Mordain sneered, stepping into the room. "The power of the mirrors is mine. I will merge the worlds, and there is nothing you can do to stop it." Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the dark sorcerer. He could feel the shards humming in his hands, pulsing with energy. For a moment, doubt crept into his mind. How could he, a regular guy, stand against someone like Mordain? But then he felt Tim's saddle, hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "We can do this," Tim said quietly, his voice steady. "You just have to trust the power of the shards." Tom swallowed hard and nodded. Together. They faced Mordain. The room seemed to crackle with energy as Mordain raised his hand, summoning a dark, swirling vortex of power. The air around them grew colder, and the walls of the attic began to warp, twisting as the boundaries between the two worlds started to blur. But Tom wasn't gonna let that happen. With a deep breath, he raised the shards in his hands, focusing all his energy on them. The shards glowed brighter, their light growing stronger, until it filled the entire room. Mordain snarled, his eyes narrowing as he realized what was happening. "No," Mordain screamed, his voice filled with rage. "You cannot stop me." But it was too late. The shards flared with blinding light, and a shockwave of energy erupted from them, shattering the mirror and sending Mordain flying back. The room trembled, the air crackling with power as the connection between the two worlds began to sever. Tom could feel the energy draining from the shards, the ancient magic finally being undone. Mordain let out a final guttural scream before his form dissolved into nothingness. His power broken. The light faded, and the attic fell silent. Tom collapsed to his knees, his hands shaking as the shards crumbled into dust. It was over. The threat was gone, and the worlds were safe. Tim knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did it," Tim said, his voice soft but filled with pride. Tom looked up at him, exhaustion washing over him like a tidal wave. "We did it," Tim smiled faintly, helping him to his feet. "Yeah, we did." As they stood there, in the quiet attic, Tom felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The worlds were safe, and though things would never be the same, he knew he'd come out stronger on the other side. Tim turned to the broken mirror, a wistful expression on his face. "I guess this is goodbye." Tom nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "Yeah, I guess it is." Tim gave him a small, almost sad smile. "Take care of yourself, Tom. And remember, don't be afraid to take risks. You were stronger than you think." Before Tom could respond, Tim's reflection faded, disappearing into the remnants of the shattered mirror. Tom stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty frame, his thoughts swirling with everything that had happened. He was back in his world. The danger was gone, but he knew that the experience had changed him in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. With a deep breath, Tom turned and left the attic, the dust settling in the quiet room once more.